Let's slow this down for a moment, because this first point is the one people resist the most. When someone cheats and then keeps coming back, the story we're usually told, and the story we desperately want to believe, is that this is about love, that they realized what they almost lost, that the cheating somehow clarified their feelings, that the return is proof of depth, attachment, or even growth. And I need to say this clearly, calmly, and honestly. In many cases, the coming back has very little to do with love and a lot to do with control. Love, at its core, is about care, consideration, and an awareness of how your actions affect another person. Cheating already violates that. But cheating and then returning, especially without deep, sustained accountability, often signals something else entirely. It signals a desire to keep access to you, to your emotional labor, to your forgiveness, to your stability, to the benefits of the relationship without the responsibility of respecting it. For some people, especially those with high entitlement or narcissistic traits, relationships are not experienced as mutual bonds. They are experienced as resources. A partner becomes a place to land, a source of validation, a safety net, a regulator of emotions. Cheating doesn't end that need. If anything, it reinforces it. They go out, they seek novelty, admiration, excitement, or power somewhere else, and then they come back because you still represent comfort, familiarity, and emotional supply. And here's the hard part to hear. Coming back doesn't necessarily mean they chose you. Sometimes it means they didn't want to lose you as an option. Control in relationships doesn't always look like dominance or aggression. Often it looks like indecision. It looks like someone who destabilizes the bond and then reappears to fix it. That push-pull dynamic keeps you emotionally preoccupied, hyper-focused on the relationship, and constantly trying to earn security. When someone cheats and then returns, especially repeatedly, they are setting the tone. They get to violate the rules, and you get to manage the fallout. Now, people will say, but they were crying. They were devastated. They said they couldn't live without me. Emotional intensity is not the same thing as emotional accountability. Distress doesn't equal insight. Someone can be genuinely upset about consequences without being committed to change. They can be afraid of abandonment without being capable of respect. Ask yourself this: when they came back, was the focus on your pain or on their discomfort? Were they curious about your experience, or primarily desperate to restore their access to you? Did they make space for your anger, your grief, your confusion, or did they rush you toward forgiveness so things could go back to normal? Because control thrives on urgency. I can't lose you. We have to fix this now. Let's not tell anyone. Let's move on. These statements aren't about healing. They're about regaining equilibrium, about resecuring a position in your life. And I want to be very careful here, because I'm not saying every person who cheats and returns is malicious or calculating. Human behavior exists on a spectrum. Some people are deeply avoidant, emotionally immature, or conflict phobic. Some panic when faced with consequences. Some genuinely don't understand the depth of harm they cause. But intent doesn't erase impact, and patterns matter more than explanations. If someone returns without demonstrating a willingness to sit in your pain, tolerate your mistrust, and accept limits on their own comfort, then what they're seeking isn't reconnection, it's restoration of control. They want things to feel familiar again. They want you to regulate their shame. They want the relationship without the reckoning. And this is where people get stuck. Because when someone comes back, it triggers hope. Hope is powerful. Hope tells you this time will be different. Hope tells you the return is proof of love. Hope tells you to minimize what happened, so you don't lose what you think you're regaining. But hope without evidence is just another way to keep you suspended in uncertainty. There's also something else happening psychologically that doesn't get talked about enough. When someone cheats and leaves, you experience abandonment. When they come back, you experience relief. That relief can feel like love, gratitude, even closeness. Your nervous system calms down, and your brain associates that calm with them. But what you're actually feeling is the end of a threat, not the presence of safety. Control thrives in that cycle. Hurt, disappearance, return, relief. Over time, you start orienting your emotional world around their movements. Their choices dictate your emotional state. And without realizing it, you start working harder to keep them from leaving again by being more understanding, more flexible, more forgiving, more quiet. This is not a dynamic built on mutual respect. It's a dynamic built on imbalance. Another important piece here is entitlement. People who repeatedly cheat and return often believe, at some level, that the rules don't fully apply to them. They believe they deserve another chance simply because they want one. They believe their apology should outweigh your pain. They believe their intention matters more than your experience. And when you accept them back without real accountability, that belief is reinforced. They learn that they can violate boundaries and still be welcomed, that the relationship will bend to accommodate their behavior, that you will absorb the emotional cost. And again, this is not about blaming you. People don't allow mistreatment because they're weak. They allow it because they're attached, hopeful, empathetic, and often deeply invested. Those are human qualities. But in the wrong relational context, those same qualities can be exploited. So when someone cheats and keeps coming back, I want you to stop asking, do they love me? And start asking, what does this pattern give them? Stability, access, validation, control, a sense of power, a place to return when things elsewhere fall apart. Love requires risk. Accountability requires humility. Control requires neither, and this sets the stage for everything that follows, because once you understand that the return may be about control rather than love, the rest of the puzzle starts to make sense. Why the apologies don't last, why the behavior doesn't fully change, why you're always the one doing the emotional work, why the cycle repeats. This isn't about demonizing the other person. It's about seeing the dynamic clearly, without the fog of hope or fear. Because clarity is not cruelty. Clarity is self-respect. And here's the line I want to leave you with when someone keeps coming back after betraying you. Don't confuse their need for access with your need for safety, though, are not the same thing. After people begin to recognize that the return may be about control rather than love, the next place the mind goes is this, but they said all the right things. And that's where we need to slow down again, because words are incredibly seductive when you're hurting. Words can sound like insight. Words can sound like remorse. Words can sound like change. But words, on their own, don't heal. Betrayal behavior does. When someone cheats and then comes back, apologies tend to arrive fast and heavy. I've never felt worse. I'll do anything. I finally understand. And in the moment, that can feel like relief. It can feel like the pain is being acknowledged, but emotional language is not the same thing as accountability. Someone can be eloquent, distressed, even convincing, and still have no capacity or intention to change. Real accountability is slow. It's boring. It's uncomfortable. And that's why it's rare. If someone is truly taking responsibility, they don't just want to end the conflict. They're willing to live inside the consequences. They understand that trust doesn't reset because they apologize. They don't pressure you to move on. They don't frame your continued hurt as a problem you need to fix. They accept that rebuilding trust is measured in months and years, not conversation and promises. Watch what happens after the initial emotional wave passes. Anyone can sound remorseful when they're afraid of losing you. The real test comes later, when the urgency fades and consistency is required. Are they still transparent when it's inconvenient? Are they still patient when you ask the same questions again? Are they still accountable when you're no longer watching as closely? Because this is where many people get stuck. The apology creates a sense of closure that hasn't actually been earned. It quiets the alarm just enough to keep the relationship going. And when the behavior doesn't fundamentally change, you're left wondering why you still feel unsettled, why your body doesn't trust what your ears heard. Your nervous system is paying attention to what their words cannot override. Accountability doesn't argue with your pain. It doesn't defend, deflect, or minimize. It doesn't say, I already said sorry, or how long are you going to hold this over my head? Those statements reveal impatience, not growth. They reveal someone who wants forgiveness without transformation. And here's something that's very important to understand. Sustained behavioral change requires tolerating shame. Most people who repeatedly cheat and return are deeply uncomfortable with shame. They want it gone as quickly as possible. They want reassurance that they're not a bad person. They want the relationship restored so they can stop feeling exposed. But healing doesn't move at the speed of their discomfort. Healing moves at the speed of trust, and trust is rebuilt through repetition, reliability, restraint. Someone who is genuinely accountable doesn't just avoid cheating again. They examine why it happened. They seek insight, often with professional help. They identify patterns, entitlement, emotional avoidance, or validation-seeking behaviors. They don't outsource the emotional labor to you. They don't expect you to coach them into being safer. They also accept limits. This is a big one. Accountability means accepting that they may not get full access to you right away or ever. It means respecting boundaries without sulking, punishing, or withdrawing. It means understanding that forgiveness is not owed, and reconciliation is not guaranteed. If someone is truly changing, they don't act as though your boundaries are obstacles. They see them as necessary. Contrast that with what often happens instead. The apology is followed by pressure. Pressure to trust again. Pressure to stop asking questions. Pressure to stop bringing it up. Pressure to focus on the future. And when you don't comply, the tone shifts. You're accused of being negative, of not letting go, of sabotaging the relationship. That's not accountability. That's control reasserting itself. And I want to say this gently but clearly: if someone becomes irritated by the consequences of their own betrayal, they are not ready for repair. Repair requires humility. It requires the ability to hold someone else's pain without centering your own discomfort. It requires emotional stamina. Another thing to watch for is performative change, big gestures, dramatic declarations, sudden intensity. These can look impressive, but they often fade once the immediate threat of loss passes. Sustainable change looks quieter. It looks like consistency when no one is watching. It looks like doing the work even when you're not actively upset. People often ask, how long should I wait to see change? There's no universal timeline, but there is a universal principle. If the burden of healing is falling primarily on you, then accountability is not actually happening. You should not be the one managing their growth, reminding them of their commitments, or suppressing your emotions to keep the peace. You didn't cause the betrayal, and you are not responsible for repairing the damage it created. And this is where self-doubt creeps in. You start wondering if you're being too harsh, too sensitive, too unforgiving, especially if they keep telling you they're trying. But effort without outcome is not transformation. Intention without impact is not repair. It's okay to require evidence. It's okay to need time. It's okay to decide that even with change, the cost was too high. Accountability does not entitle someone to another chance. It only makes a chance possible. If someone is truly committed to change, they don't ask you to trust them again. They work in ways that make trust slowly, organically, and reluctantly return. And if that trust doesn't return, they respect that too. This point matters deeply because it sets the foundation for everything else. Without sustained behavioral change, returning after cheating simply resets the cycle. The same pain, the same confusion, the same erosion of self-trust, just delayed. And here is the line I want you to remember. Apologies can be spoken in a moment, but accountability is proven over time. Only behavior gets to make that argument. Once you start to see that the return may not be about love, and once you recognize that words without sustained behavior don't equal accountability. The next question people quietly ask themselves is this: then why is it so hard to leave? And this is where I want you to be very gentle with yourself, because the answer is not weakness. The answer is wiring. When someone cheats, disappears emotionally or physically, and then comes back, your nervous system is put through an intense cycle. There is shock, fear, abandonment, self-doubt. Your body goes into threat mode. You replay conversations, question your worth, and brace for loss. Then they return. Suddenly there's relief. The pain eases, your body calms, your breath slows, and without realizing it, your brain links them to the relief of the pain they caused. That is the foundation of a trauma bond. This is not a romantic attachment. This is a survival response. Your nervous system is learning that distress is followed by reconnection. That pain is followed by closeness. That instability is followed by relief. And the more intense the emotional swing, the stronger that bond becomes. High pain paired with intermittent reward creates attachment that feels urgent, obsessive, and deeply confusing. This is why logic alone doesn't break the cycle. You can know the relationship is harming you and still feel pulled toward the person who hurt you. You can see the pattern and still crave their reassurance. That doesn't mean you're foolish. It means your nervous system is trying to regulate itself. And people who cheat and come back, especially repeatedly, often reinforce this cycle without consciously intending to. They destabilize the bond and then temporarily repair it. Push, pull, hurt, soothe, withdraw, return. Over time, Your emotional world starts orbiting around their behavior. You're not just in a relationship with them, you're in a relationship with anticipation. You wait for the text. You monitor the tone. You feel anxious when things are quiet and relieved when they reach out. Your body becomes hyper-attuned to signs of connection or distance. That hypervigilance isn't love, it's survival. And here's where people are incredibly hard on themselves. They say, if it's so bad, why do I miss them? Or, if they hurt me, why do I feel closer when they come back? Because closeness after threat feels intense. It feels earned. It feels meaningful. But intensity is not intimacy. Trauma bonds thrive on inconsistency. Stable, predictable care doesn't create this kind of attachment. Intermittent reinforcement does. The uncertainty keeps you engaged. The hope keeps you invested. And the relief keeps you coming back for more. This is also why people often feel worse after reconciliation than they expected. They think the return will fix everything. But instead they feel anxious, guarded, and emotionally raw. That's because the underlying threat hasn't gone away. Your body knows the pattern, even if your mind is trying to override it. And if the person who cheated minimizes what happened, rushes forgiveness, or becomes defensive when you express pain, the trauma bond deepens. Why? Because now you're not only managing betrayal, you're managing emotional invalidation. You start suppressing your feelings to keep the connection. You learn that expressing hurt risks losing them again. That's a powerful conditioning loop. Another piece that's rarely talked about is how trauma bonding erodes self-trust. After repeated cycles of hurt and repair, you stop trusting your instincts. You question your reactions. You wonder if you're overreacting. You look to them for reassurance about your reality. And that dependence reinforces the bond even further. You're not just attached to the person, you're attached to the hope that this time will be different. That the return means something has shifted. That the pain will finally make sense. Hope becomes the glue. But hope in this context keeps you negotiating with harm. This is why advice like just leave or know your worth can feel hollow. Trauma bonds are not broken by insight alone. They are broken by safety, consistency, and time away from the cycle. Your nervous system needs repeated experiences of calm that are not followed by threat. It needs to relearn what stability feels like. And here's something very important. The person who created the trauma bond cannot be the one to heal it. If the same person continues to destabilize and soothe, the bond remains intact. Healing requires distance from the cycle, not deeper immersion in it. This doesn't mean people who are bonded are doomed or powerless. It means they need compassion, not judgment. It means the pull they feel is not evidence that the relationship is right. It's evidence that the relationship has been dysregulating. And for those who say, but when it's good, it's really good, I want you to pause and ask yourself, is it good? Or is it just the absence of pain? Relief can feel euphoric when you've been bracing for loss. Real connection doesn't require emotional whiplash. Real safety doesn't come with constant vigilance. Real intimacy doesn't ask you to betray yourself to preserve it. Understanding trauma bonding doesn't mean you instantly stop feeling attached. It means you stop shaming yourself for feeling attached. And that shift from self-blame to self-understanding is where healing actually begins, because once you see the bond for what it is, you can stop romanticizing the cycle and start prioritizing your nervous system. You can start asking not why do I want them, but what does my body need to feel safe again? And that question changes everything. Here's the line I want to leave you with. If the relationship feels addictive, destabilizing, and impossible to leave, that's not love pulling you back. It's your nervous system trying to survive. A cycle it never should have been placed in. Once you understand how control can masquerade as love, once you see why apologies without behavior don't heal anything, and once you recognize how trauma bonding keeps you emotionally tethered, the next realization can be one of the most sobering and strangely clarifying of all. Repeated infidelity is not a mistake. It's a pattern. And patterns tell you far more about someone than promises ever will. A mistake is something that happens once, followed by genuine reflection, accountability, and lasting change. A pattern is something that repeats despite conversations, tears, consequences, and second chances. When someone cheats, comes back, reassures you, and then does it again, or behaves in ways that keep trust permanently unstable, that's not confusion. That's information. People are often reluctant to accept this because patterns dismantle hope. If it's a mistake, there's a path forward. If it's a pattern, You're forced to confront a much harder truth. This is who they are in relationships right now. And that truth can feel devastating, especially if you've invested time, love, loyalty, and identity into the bond. But patterns don't exist in isolation. They're the result of traits, values, coping mechanisms, and belief systems. Someone who repeatedly cheats is showing you something about their relationship to boundaries, entitlement, empathy, and impulse control. They are showing you how they handle temptation, accountability, and discomfort. And most importantly, they are showing you how much or how little your pain factors in their decision making. People often say, but they said they'd never do it again. Of course they did. People in RNS often mean what they say in the moment. The issue isn't sincerity, it's capacity. Wanting to change and being able to change are not the same thing. Insight without skill doesn't alter behavior. Remorse without restraint doesn't prevent repetition. And here's where things get even more complicated. When someone repeats infidelity, they often frame each incident as separate. Different circumstances, different stressors, different explanations. But when you zoom out, the common denominator is them. Different stories, same outcome. Patterns persist because they serve a purpose. They regulate emotion. They provide validation. They relieve boredom. They reinforce a sense of power or desirability. And unless that underlying payoff is addressed, the behavior will continue regardless of how much it hurt you. This is why people who cheat repeatedly often seem genuinely surprised when trust doesn't return. In their mind, each apology should reset the slate. But trust isn't restored through regret, it's restored through predictability. And predictability is the one thing patterns of betrayal destroy. Another reason people struggle to accept patterns is because doing so forces a reckoning with potential. You don't just lose the person, you lose the future you imagined with them. The version of them you hoped they would become. The relationship you thought you were building toward. And that grief is real. But staying attached to potential while ignoring patterns is one of the most painful forms of self-betrayal. Patterns also erode your sense of reality over time. Each recurrence chips away at your confidence in your own judgment. You start thinking, maybe I didn't communicate clearly enough. Maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe this time will be the turning point. And slowly, responsibility shifts from their behavior to your reaction to it. That's a dangerous shift, because when patterns are normalized, boundaries start to feel negotiable. Standards start to feel unrealistic, and eventually you find yourself tolerating things you never thought you would just to keep the relationship intact. And let's be very clear about this. Recognizing a pattern is not about labeling someone as irredeemable. People can grow, people can change. But change requires sustained effort, insight, and often external support. It requires time, and it requires a willingness to sit with discomfort without escaping it through old behaviors. What matters is not whether change is theoretically possible, but whether it is actually happening. And that can only be assessed through observation, not hope. If someone has cheated, returned, and then continued to behave in ways that keep trust fragile, secretive behavior, defensiveness, minimization, blame shifting, impatience with your healing, that is the pattern. Continuing, even if the behavior looks different on the surface, patterns evolve. They don't always repeat in identical ways, but the impact remains the same: instability, anxiety, and erosion of self-worth. And here's the part people don't like to hear. Patterns don't require your permission to continue. They only require your participation. That doesn't mean you caused them. It means you have a choice about whether you remain in them. Choosing to step out of a pattern doesn't make you unforgiving. It makes you honest. Honest about what you've seen. Honest about what you can live with. Honest about what your nervous system can sustain. And this is where clarity becomes empowering. When you stop framing repeated infidelity as isolated incidents and start seeing it as a pattern, your decision-making changes. You stop negotiating with each new promise. You stop waiting for the right explanation. You stop investing in words and start paying attention to trajectories. Trajectories matter. Where is this relationship actually going? Not where you hope it will go, not where it briefly appears to go after a crisis, but where it consistently moves over time. If the answer is continued instability, continued self-doubt, continued vigilance, then the pattern is speaking clearly. You don't need certainty to honor what you're seeing. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You don't need to wait for the next betrayal to justify leaving. Patterns don't need a finale, they are already the evidence. And here is the line I want you to carry with you. When someone shows you the same betrayal in different packaging, stop calling it a mistake. Patterns don't ask for your hope. They ask for your attention. By the time people get to this point in the conversation, there's often a quiet, heavy realization sitting in the room. You've seen the control. You've seen the lack of sustained change. You've felt the trauma bond. You've recognized the pattern. And then another thought creeps in, one that brings a lot of shame with it if we don't talk about it carefully. Have I been teaching them how to treat me? I want to be very clear from the start. No one deserves to be cheated on. No one causes someone else's betrayal. Accountability for infidelity always belongs to the person who chose it. Full stop. But relationships are systems, and within systems, behavior gets reinforced. Not intentionally, not consciously, but repeatedly. When someone cheats, comes back, and is allowed to resume the relationship without meaningful consequences, something subtle but powerful happens. The relationship absorbs the betrayal. The system adapts. And what was once unthinkable becomes survivable. That doesn't mean you approved of it. It means the relationship learned that it could continue in spite of it. And people pay very close attention to what they can get away with. Tolerance is often confused with compassion. Forgiveness is confused with resilience. Flexibility is confused with love. But when tolerance replaces boundaries, the message received is not "I am kind." The message received is "this is acceptable." Again, not because you said it, but because the behavior continued without a structural shift. Many people believe boundaries are ultimatums or punishments. They're not. Boundaries are information. They tell someone what happens when a line is crossed. And when boundaries are declared but not enforced, they stop being boundaries and start being suggestions. So when someone cheats and is met with explanations, second chances, emotional labor, and reassurance, but not real consequences, the relationship teaches them something. It teaches them that the pain they caused is survivable for you, that the rupture will heal itself, that their access to you is resilient, even under strain. And over time, this reshapes the power dynamic. You begin adapting to keep the relationship intact. You become more careful about how you express hurt. You shorten your reactions. You preemptively soften your needs. You might even tell yourself, "I don't want to push them away." And slowly, without meaning to, you move further away from yourself. This is not weakness. This is attachment trying to preserve connection. But here's the cost. When someone doesn't experience meaningful loss or disruption after betrayal, their motivation to change remains theoretical. They may feel bad. They may feel guilty. But discomfort alone doesn't change behavior. Consequences do. And consequences don't have to be dramatic. They don't have to be punitive. They simply have to be real. A real consequence might be reduced access, loss of emotional intimacy, a pause in the relationship, a requirement for sustained therapeutic work, a restructuring of trust that centers your safety, not their comfort. Or sometimes the consequence is the relationship ending. When those things don't happen, tolerance quietly trains the relationship. This is why people often find themselves saying, "I don't recognize myself anymore," because the version of you that once had clear lines has been worn down by repeated negotiations with harm. Each time you stay, you give up a little more ground, not because you want to, but because you're trying to survive the relationship. And here's the painful paradox. The more you tolerate, the less you're valued. Not because you're less worth. Why? But because respect erodes in the absence of limits. Healthy relationships are shaped by mutual accountability. Unhealthy ones are shaped by how much one person absorbs. People who repeatedly cheat and return often operate with an unspoken belief: you'll adapt. And when you do, that belief hardens. They may even start seeing your tolerance as proof that the behavior wasn't that bad, or that you've moved on, or that it's safe to minimize what happened. This is why people sometimes feel a surge of clarity only after they finally enforce a boundary. Suddenly, the other person panics. Suddenly, they promise real change. Suddenly, they say, "I didn't realize how serious this was." And that moment can be deeply unsettling because it reveals something important. They understood the stakes once the stakes affected them. That doesn't mean the change is real or lasting, but it does tell you something about how the system has been operating. Boundaries aren't about controlling someone else's behavior. They're about protecting your internal world. They say, "This is what I can live with. This is what I can't. And when those boundaries are violated repeatedly without consequence, something inside you starts to collapse. Self-trust weakens. Self-respect erodes, and you begin orienting your choices around keeping the relationship rather than keeping yourself intact. And that's the moment people start blaming themselves, not for the cheating, but for staying. Why did I allow this? Why didn't I leave sooner? And I want you to hear this. You didn't allow betrayal. You endured it. There's a difference, but endurance should never be mistaken for obligation. At some point, continuing to tolerate harm becomes its own kind of boundary violation, one you commit against yourself. And recognizing that isn't about shame. It's about reclaiming agency. You are not responsible for teaching someone to respect you, but you are responsible for noticing when you are being disrespected and deciding what you will do next. And this is where things shift, because the moment you stop prioritizing their comfort over your safety, the entire dynamic changes. You may lose the relationship. You may lose the version of them you hoped for, but you regain something far more important: alignment with yourself. Boundaries clarify reality. They expose whether someone values the relationship enough to meet you where you are, or whether they only valued it when it cost them nothing. And that clarity, while painful, is liberating. So if you take nothing else from this point, take this: you are not asking for too much by requiring fidelity, honesty, and respect. You are asking the wrong person if those needs keep being treated as optional. At this point in the conversation, after everything we've walked through together, there's usually a deep quiet that settles in, not because there's nothing left to say, but because the truth is starting to land. You've looked at control. You've questioned words without vire. You've understood the trauma bond. You've seen the pattern. You've examined how tolerance reshapes dynamics. And then you arrive at the hardest, most tender realization of all. Choosing yourself may mean walking away. This is where so many people get stuck, not because they don't know what's happening, but because of what leaving represents. Leaving feels like failure. It feels like giving up. It feels like admitting you were wrong. It feels like confirming your worst fears, that the love wasn't enough, that the effort didn't matter, that the story you believe in isn't going to have the ending you hoped for. And I want to gently, firmly say this: choosing yourself is not failure. It's clarity. Most people don't stay in harmful relationships because they lack strength. They stay because they have hope, because they can see potential, because they remember who the person was at the beginning, because they've invested time, energy, identity, and love. Walking away from that doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels like grief. And that grief is real. You're not just leaving a person. You're leaving a future you imagined, a version of yourself you thought you would become in that relationship, a story you told yourself about endurance, loyalty, and love winning in the end. Letting go of that is profoundly painful, and it deserves to be honored, not rushed, not minimized, and certainly not shamed. But staying when the cost is your nervous system, your self-trust, your peace, and your sense of self, that's not loyalty. That's self-abandonment. One of the most damaging myths we carry is that strong people stay and work things out at all costs. In reality, strong people know when something is no longer workable. They know when effort has turned into erosion. They know when love has turned into vigilance. And choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing yourself to prove that you do. People often say, but what if they finally change after I leave? And yes, sometimes that happens. But if change only comes once you're gone, then the relationship itself was not the container for that change. And you are not required to stay in harm just to see if someone might someday become safer. Change is not a promise. You owe yourself patience for when the present is hurting you. Another fear that comes up here is, what if I never find this kind of connection again? That question doesn't come from intuition. It comes from trauma. Trauma narrows the future. It convinces you that this pain is familiar, and familiarity feels safer than the unknown. But familiar pain is still pain. Choosing yourself often feels lonely at first. There's a quiet that replaces the chaos, and that quiet can be unsettling if you've been living in emotional noise for a long time. But over time, that quiet becomes spacious. Your body relaxes. Your thoughts slow down. You start hearing yourself again. And something very important happens. Your self-trust begins to return. You start remembering what it feels like to not be constantly bracing, to not be analyzing tone, timing, or behavior. To not be negotiating your needs into something smaller so they're easier to swallow. You begin to reconnect with your own instincts, and that reconnection is one of the most healing experiences there is. People often worry that leaving means they didn't try hard enough, but effort is not measured by endurance alone. It's measured by discernment. Knowing when something has reached its limit is not quitting its wisdom. And here's another truth that doesn't get said often enough. Closure does not come from the other person changing, apologizing perfectly, or finally understanding your pain. Closure comes from you deciding that you no longer need them to be different in order for you to be okay. That decision is powerful. Choosing yourself may disappoint people. It may confuse them. It may even provoke backlash from someone who benefited from your tolerance. But the people who truly care about you will eventually see that you are calmer, clearer, and more yourself. And most importantly, you will feel that this choice doesn't require anger. It doesn't require bitterness. It doesn't even require certainty. It only requires honesty. Honesty about what the relationship is actually costing you, not on good days, but over time. And if you're still questioning whether you're allowed to choose, say yourself, let me say this as plainly as I can. You do not need permission to protect your well-being. You do not need a dramatic final betrayal to justify leaving. You do not need to explain yourself into exhaustion. You are allowed to stop trying to earn safety in a place that keeps proving it cannot offer it. Choosing yourself is not about closing your heart. It's about opening it to yourself, to peace, to stability, to relationships that don't require you to disappear in order to stay. And here's the final line I want you to take with you. Walking away from someone who keeps hurting you is not losing love. It's finally refusing to lose yourself.